Hey guys, I'm making this video here today to talk about hand traps in GOAT format. I've been playing GOAT format for a while now, a few years, and I never really realized that there were hand traps in GOAT format, and I think a lot of other people are also not aware of that fact. I don't really play modern Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, but if you do, you're probably familiar with hand traps like Effect Failure, DD Crow, Ash Blossom, etc. And you might not be aware that actually hand traps have existed for a while. So I'm just going to go through some of the different hand traps you can play. Some of them are more viable than others, but yeah, just want to make you aware of them. I kind of have them here in order of playability, so I'll start with those and then talk about some of the other ones after. Starting us off, we have Crebo, which is like the OG hand trap. I think a lot of people forget that this card exists, but I've actually been seeing it played recently. I actually made a Reasoning Gate deck, so this card has been used against me, and it really took me by surprise. Um, if your opponent attacks or is about to do damage from battle, you can discard this card and have that damage reduced to 0. So you can do this for like a single attack, which could be game changing against Reasoning Gate decks or maybe Stein Gate decks, especially Stein Gate decks, because they typically try to deal lethal with like a single attack, right? They'll bring out the big koala guy and then slap a megamorph on it and try to do like 8,000 plus damage with a single attack. So if you can stop that one attack and survive for another turn, you might be able to turn things around. So that's pretty sweet. And those decks often play cards to get rid of your back row, like Heavy Storm. A lot of them play 2 to 3 True Nades, maybe even Visor Shock. So they usually think that they're good um, by bouncing those cards back to your hand or destroying them. But then you could be sitting on this Crebo and then, waiting to use it at the right time and prevent them from doing lethal. Um, Another thing is that a lot of players will play cards like Threatening Roar or Hollow Life Barrier to kind of prevent those OTK decks because you can chain them when your opponent activates like Heavy Storm or a Giant Trunade. But those are traps, right? So if your opponent is playing Jinzo, which a lot of Reasoning Gate decks do, then you wouldn't be able to use those cards, right? Whereas Crebo, you can obviously still use it. And another thing to point out is that it is a dark, so that is relevant for Chaos decks. So it could be an especially cool tech in like Chaos Turbo deck or something. Next up, we have Neko Main King, which isn't strictly a hand trap because it can be activated regardless of where it's sent from, whether it's sent from the deck, field, or hand. I believe this card was errated or reworded later on to say during your opponent's turn when this card in your possession is sent to the graveyard. But I believe the original print and ruling just says when it's sent to the graveyard. So that could probably be from anywhere. Someone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure if this gets milled or sent from your field to the graveyard, it'll still trigger the effect. But it says that during your opponent's turn, when this card in your possession is sent to the graveyard by an opponent's effect, it becomes the end phase of their turn. So this is really useful against empty jar decks, which is primarily what's played against when your opponent is using like Cyberjar and looping you with Cyberjar, or if they use Morphing Jar, it'll immediately go to the end phase of their turn, which I want to point out, that's not the same thing as saying it immediately ends their turn. It just goes to the end phase of their turn. So they could still like activate like spell speed 2 stuff or stuff like that. But it will effectively prevent them from OTKing you or FTKing you. So it could be used to great effect against empty jar decks or other mill decks or something. And then the next card, Gravekeepers Watcher. It has a pretty similar use case to Neko Main King, but it's a little bit different. It says that during either player's turn, when your opponent activates an effect that would make them discard when it resolves, you can send this to the grave, negate the activation, and destroy that card. The really important thing to take away here is that it says when that card resolves, meaning that this card cannot be used to stop card effects that discard a card for cost. So if your opponent is using something like Monster Reincarnation or Tribe Infecting Virus, which both discard for cost, this card will not be able to be used against them. It's only for cards that discard a card as part of the effect. So cards like Card Destruction or Graceful Charity, this could be used against them. And then also like Morphing Jar, this will stop Morphing Jar in a similar way to Neko King, or not in a similar way to Neko King, but it'll stop and destroy Morphing Jar, which could be useful. I'd say it's a little bit less potent and effective against Empty Jar decks, because usually those decks have a way to recur their Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar via the Shallow Grave and like Premature Burial. So even if you do destroy them, they can usually just get them back. Whereas Neko King will skip to the end phase of their turn, which prevents them from OTKing you that turn. But it is a dark, which is again relevant for Chaos decks. It has alright stats. They're not terrible, but they're not the greatest. And it is a Gravekeeper, so it could be a cool tech, especially in Gravekeepers. But yeah, I think a lot of people aren't aware of this card's existence, and I wanted to highlight it. From this point on, the cards get a little bit less playable and viable, but I'm just going to go through them to create awareness for them. We have Electric Snake, which says when it's discarded by an effect and sent to, or when it's discarded by your opponent's effect and sent to the graveyard, you draw 2 cards from your deck. So this could be pretty sweet against like Delinquent Duo or Card Destruction, or maybe even like Danzalug if they hit this. It could be a pretty cool effect. And then you have a couple others. Actually, this card should be over here. Elfin Statue of Disaster and Minar. They're both really similar in that when they're discarded by your opponent's card effect and sent to the graveyard, they burn your opponent. The Elfin does 2,000 burn damage, and Minar does 1,000. I think that the Elfin is pretty much strictly better than Minar, since it's the same level and same attribute and has like better attack, and also does like twice as much burn damage. The only difference is their type. This is rock and this is insect, so if that's relevant, I guess that could affect which one you play. Next up, we have Charm of Sabtai, which is a Gravekeeper specific card. I don't really see this card as playable or viable siding or maining, unless maybe you're playing a fun Gravekeepers deck, but if you're playing anything that's trying to be competitive, you probably wouldn't even play this even in a Gravekeepers deck. But you can discard it during either player's turn, and Gravekeeper monsters cannot be destroyed by battle, which is kind of cool. Next 3 are all zombies. We have Regenerating Mummy, Despair from the Dark, and Fear from the Dark. Regenerating Mummy is when it's sent from your hand to the graveyard from your opponent's card effect, and these 2, Despair from the Dark and Fear from the Dark, are when they are sent to the graveyard by your opponent's card effect, even if it was from your deck, so it could be your hand or deck. Regenerating Mummy returns itself to your hand when it's discarded. So again, if your opponent duos you, you can discard this card and immediately get it back to your hand, which is kind of cool. And then these 2 special summon themselves to the field. So if your opponent mills them from your deck or sends them from your hand to the graveyard, they'll both special summon themselves to the field and put a body on the field, which is pretty neat. Like I said, they're all zombies, so I guess if you're playing a zombie deck, these could be cool tech choices. And then the last 3, I don't really see them as really viable like at all. Like these guys, I guess there are some use cases where you might want to play them, but these last 3, I don't really see why you would play them. But you have Burning Algae, which when it's sent to the graveyard. Oh, and another thing to highlight here is that these 3 aren't really hand traps, but they all activate when they're sent to the graveyard, regardless of where they're sent from. So they're kind of like Dandelion in that sense. But you have Burning Algae when it's sent to the graveyard. You increase your opponent's life points by 1,000, which I don't really see why you'd want to do that unless you're playing like a fun burn deck with bad reaction to Samoshi or something. You have Archfiend of Guilford, where when it's sent to the grave, you can target a face-up monster on the field, either yours or your opponent's, and that monster loses 500 attack. So that's not very good. It is dark though, which is interesting. And then you have Cockroach Knight, where when it's sent to the graveyard, it bounces itself to the top of the deck. I don't really see why you would play this, but just like based on the way it's worded and the fact that it's like not once per turn, as a lot of old cards aren't, but just the way it's worded kind of sounds like it could be used in a really sacky FTK or OTK deck, kind of like Butterfly Dagger, how it just keeps bouncing itself to your hand, or it's also kind of like a monster version of Horn of Unicorn, but I don't really see why you would play it. But yeah, so these are all the hand traps that I'm aware of. I just wanted to talk about them since I really couldn't find any information about hand traps in Goat format on YouTube or Google. Let me know if you're aware of any that I missed here. And yeah, thanks. Cheers.